My name is Samantha. At 28 years old, I believed I understood what betrayal truly felt like. My childhood had taught me a great deal about unfairness, especially as I worked 2 jobs throughout college while my younger brother, James, seemed to have everything given to him effortlessly. Yet, nothing could have prepared me for the night I overheard my father assure my brother not to worry, because they would make me pay for everything. Their scheme absolutely devastated my world, but what they didn't know, however, was that I would refuse to let them take a single cent from me. I was raised in a middle-class suburban neighborhood in Pennsylvania. My father was an accountant at a local firm, and my mother worked as a sales associate at a department store. To an outsider, we appeared to be a perfect American family, with our modest 2-story house, a well-kept lawn, and summer trips to the beach every year. But within the walls of our home, the reality was quite different. As the firstborn, I was constantly held to impossibly high standards. My parents expected me to be perfect and responsible from the moment I could follow directions. I remember my father would ask why I hadn't gotten an A+ if I brought home an A-. When I won 2nd place in the 4th grade science fair, my mother would express her disappointment, wondering aloud why I couldn't have just worked a little harder for 1st place. Then came my brother, James, who was 5 years my junior. The moment my parents brought him home from the hospital, it became clear he would be treated differently. While my room had plain white furniture, James received a custom race car bed and walls adorned with expensive decals. He would unwrap the latest video games, toys, and gadgets, while I would get practical gifts like clothes and books. When I asked about the differences, my mother would explain that my brother was still little, and my father would add that boys needed more encouragement, as if being a girl made me naturally more resilient to disappointment. By the age of 10, my responsibilities included washing dishes, helping with laundry, and keeping my room spotless. In contrast, James would leave a trail of toys and snack wrappers all over the house with no consequences. Whenever I complained, my mother would just sigh and tell me to pick up after him, saying that he was just being a boy. When I turned 12, babysitting was added to my list of chores, and I became the unpaid caretaker whenever my parents went out. They would tell me I was so mature for my age, as if it were a compliment instead of the burden they had placed on me. I remember the Christmas when I was 14 as being particularly painful. For months, I had been asking for a laptop for school, doing research on affordable options and explaining how it would help with my assignments. On Christmas morning, I unwrapped a second-hand laptop that barely functioned. A couple of hours later, James was tearing open the packaging of a brand new gaming computer that had cost 3 times as much as the one I had requested. When my father saw the look on my face, he explained that James needed it for his games, which he said helped with hand-eye coordination and problem-solving. I wondered to myself about my own education and needs, but I didn't say anything because I already knew their answer. When I turned 16, I got my first job at a local grocery store, working on weekends and during summer breaks, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to earn my own money. I saw James get a generous allowance for just existing, while I had to work 20 hours a week just to afford the basics that my parents gave to him for free. My father would pat me on the shoulder and say that my job builds character, as if he was doing me a favor by forcing me into early adulthood. In high school, the differences became even more apparent. When I needed money for a school trip to Washington, D.C., my parents told me to use my own savings. 6 months later, they paid for James to attend a 2-week computer camp that cost twice as much. My mother told me that James needed these opportunities for his future. My own future, it seemed, wasn't worth the same kind of investment. This pattern continued through every birthday, holiday, and milestone. James was celebrated and rewarded, while I was given expectations and responsibilities. My achievements were met with a quick nod and a brief acknowledgement, while his mediocre accomplishments were celebrated with parties and expensive gifts. The most painful part wasn't the material differences, which were substantial, but rather the emotional investment my parents poured into James while leaving me to fend for myself. They cheered loudly from the sidelines at every one of his soccer games, but they missed my Honor Society induction because something came up at work. They framed his participation certificates and his middle school art projects, while my academic awards gathered dust in a drawer. All the while, I watched James transform from a spoiled child into an entitled teenager. He would throw tantrums when he didn't get his way and had a concerning lack of empathy for others. By the time he was 18, he could barely do his own laundry or make a simple meal, but my parents just laughed it off as typical boy behavior and continued to coddle him. Meanwhile, I retreated further into myself, building emotional walls and focusing on the only thing I could control, my own future. I studied harder than anyone else in my class, joined every academic club that could help my college applications, and worked those grocery store shifts with determination, saving every single dollar I could. My mother would ask why I had to be so serious whenever I turned down a family movie night to study. My father would comment that I would miss those years once they were gone when I chose work shifts over family get-togethers. They never seemed to grasp that I had already missed out on the family experience that they so freely gave to James. I wasn't their child in the same way he was. I was their responsibility, their helper, their backup plan, but never their priority. By the time I graduated from high school as valedictorian, I had already come to accept that my success would always be seen as expected, not exceptional. As I stood at the podium giving my speech about hard work and perseverance, I looked out at my family in the audience. My parents were there, of course, but I caught them nudging James to pay attention instead of watching me with pride. That night, while friends and relatives were congratulating me, I made a silent promise to myself. I would build a life so successful and so impressive that even my parents would be forced to acknowledge my worth. This wasn't because I still needed their approval, but because I had to prove to myself that I wasn't the afterthought they had made me feel like for 18 years. I had no idea that this decision would eventually lead me to the most painful betrayal of my life, but ultimately, to my freedom. The summer after I graduated from high school was a blur of long shifts at the grocery store and getting ready for college. I had been accepted to a respected state university with a partial academic scholarship that covered about 40% of my tuition. It was an achievement I was proud of, but it still left me with a significant financial gap to fill. One evening in July, my father called me into his home office, saying we needed to discuss college. My mother sat next to him, her expression carefully neutral. I had known this conversation was coming for a long time. My parents had vaguely mentioned helping with my education for years, but that evening, as I sat across from them, I watched them exchange glances before my father cleared his throat. He began shuffling papers on his desk, telling me that they had reviewed their finances and had decided they could not contribute to my college expenses. The words were a physical blow, even though I had half expected them. What he said next hurt even more. My mother added softly that they needed to save for James's education, saying that those prestigious computer science programs cost a fortune. James was still 3 years away from college, but his education was already taking priority over mine. I told them I understood. What else was I supposed to say? Arguing wouldn't change anything, and crying would only give them the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. Instead, I asked practical questions about financial aid and student loans, taking notes as if it were a business meeting instead of another parental betrayal. That night, I updated my budget and applied for every additional scholarship I could find. I also applied for 3 more part-time jobs near campus, knowing I would need to work at least 20 hours a week to afford books, housing, and the portion of tuition my scholarship wouldn't cover. By September, I had 2 jobs, one at the university library for 15 hours a week, and another at a coffee shop on weekends. Between classes, work, and studying, I was only getting about 5 hours of sleep per night that first semester. My tiny dorm room became my sanctuary, the first space that was truly my own. I decorated it minimally with secondhand finds, focusing on making a peaceful environment for the little time I actually got to spend there. My roommate, Alyssa, quickly became a friend, and she often expressed concern about my punishing schedule. One night, she found me studying at 3 a.m. after my closing shift at the coffee shop and warned me that I couldn't keep that up for 4 years. Without looking up from my textbook, I told her to just watch me. The exhaustion was very real. Some mornings, I could barely get myself out of bed, and some nights, I'd fall asleep with my face pressed against my laptop keyboard. My immune system was weakened by stress and lack of sleep, so I caught every cold that went around the dorms that first winter. Still, I never missed a class, never turned in an assignment late, never failed an exam, and most importantly, never asked my parents for a single dollar. They would call sometimes, but the brief conversations usually focused on James's latest achievements. He had made the varsity soccer team and was selected for an advanced computer science program. He needed a new laptop for school projects. During one call, my mother told me they had just bought him the newest MacBook Pro, which she said cost a small fortune, but my father considered it an investment in his future. I thought about my own ancient laptop, held together with duct tape, but I didn't say anything. During my sophomore year, I majored in finance, discovering a real passion for the subject that went beyond its practical career prospects. Numbers made sense to me, financial models didn't play favorites or change the rules. There was a clarity and fairness in the world of finance that I had never experienced in my own family. I excelled in my classes and earned the respect of my professors, who began to mentor me and recommend me for internships. The summer after my junior year, I landed a coveted internship at a financial firm in New York City. The position paid me enough to afford a tiny apartment and save a small amount of money, which was my first taste of the financial independence I craved. That internship changed everything. My performance impressed senior management so much that they offered me a full-time position after I graduated, with a starting salary that seemed astronomical to someone who had been counting pennies for years. When I called my parents to share the news, their response was predictably underwhelming. My mother simply said, "That sounds nice, honey," and then, as if it was an afterthought, mentioned that James had been accepted into that computer science summer program at MIT, and how proud they were of him. By the time I graduated summa cum laude with my finance degree, I had worked thousands of hours at multiple jobs, taken out the minimum student loans possible, and had secured a position that would allow me to repay those loans within 2 years if I lived frugally. At 22, I moved to New York City and began my career. My tiny studio apartment felt like a luxury compared to the shared dorm rooms and summer sublets I had grown used to. For the first time, I could buy groceries without checking the price of every item and even occasionally treat myself to small indulgences like takeout coffee or a new book. I opened several savings accounts, each with a specific goal: an emergency fund, student loan repayment, and a down payment for a future home. I carefully allocated every paycheck, with the majority going to savings rather than spending. The frugal habits I had formed in college were not easily broken. Even as my income grew, my hard work at the financial firm quickly paid off. I volunteered for challenging projects, worked longer hours than required, and consistently exceeded performance metrics. I got my first promotion after 18 months, and another a year after that. Each step up the corporate ladder meant more responsibility, but also more compensation and benefits. By the time I was 26, I had fully repaid my student loans, built a 6-month emergency fund, and started investing aggressively for my retirement. At 27, I had saved enough for a down payment on a small but well-located 1-bedroom condo in Brooklyn. The day I signed the mortgage papers was probably the proudest moment of my life. I had a home that was truly mine, bought with money I had earned through years of sacrifice and determination. Over the years, my relationship with my family stayed distant but cordial. I would call on birthdays and major holidays and send appropriate gifts for Christmas and anniversaries. I'd visit Pennsylvania once or twice a year for brief, often awkward visits, where the conversation always revolved around James and whatever he was up to. James eventually went to college, though not for the prestigious computer science program my parents had wanted. After getting mediocre high school grades, he ended up at the same state university I had attended, but with my parents' full financial support. From what I could gather during those stilted family conversations, he had changed majors 3 times and took 5 years to graduate with a general business degree. He then moved back home, apparently to figure out his next steps. At 28, I had built the independent life I had promised myself as a teenager. I had financial security, a successful career, my own home, and a small but loyal group of friends who had become my chosen family. I had proven to myself that I could not only survive but thrive without the support that had been so freely given to my brother. And then came the fateful weekend visit home that would change everything. I went back to Pennsylvania for my mother's 55th birthday that April weekend. Despite our complicated relationship, I had never failed to acknowledge her birthday with at least a card and a gift. This year, I decided to make the trip home, partly out of obligation and partly because it had been nearly 8 months since my last visit. I arrived on Friday evening with an expensive handbag that my mother had been hinting about for months. It was elegantly wrapped with a card that expressed more warmth than I typically felt. My father greeted me with his usual distant politeness, giving me a brief side hug before going back to the baseball game on TV. My mother took the gift with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She told me I had finally made it, and added that James had been there since Thursday. Of course he had been. James, now 23, was still living at home even though he had graduated from college the year before. He came out of the kitchen with a beer in his hand, looking basically the same as he had during my last visit. His designer clothes and new smartwatch suggested that he wasn't struggling financially despite his lack of a steady job. He greeted me with a slight smirk and called me the corporate drone, asking about life in the big city. I neutrally replied that it was busy but good, having learned long ago that sharing the details of my success only led to awkward silence or a quick change of subject. That evening, dinner was a familiar experience of discussing James's life and achievements, however meager they were. He had applied for a few positions at tech companies but was being selective about his options. He had joined a recreational soccer league and was considering a coding boot camp that would really launch his career. My mother mentioned that the program cost $12,000, but she and my father thought it was a worthwhile investment. I thought about how they had balked at contributing even a fraction of that amount to my own college education. After dinner, James left to meet friends at a local bar while I helped my mother clean up the kitchen. We made small talk about her friends, her garden club, and the neighbor's new renovation project. It was the kind of superficial conversation you have with an acquaintance, not an intimate discussion between a mother and daughter. As she wiped down the counters, she said we would celebrate properly the next day because she had made reservations at Giovanni's for 6 o'clock. I knew Giovanni's was the most expensive restaurant in town, a place reserved for truly special occasions. I nodded again, knowing they would expect me to contribute significantly to the bill, even though they had made the reservation. By 10:30, the house was quiet. My parents had gone to their bedroom, and I was settled in my childhood room, which had been converted into a generic guest room with all traces of my adolescence removed. James still wasn't back from his night out. I couldn't sleep in the unfamiliar bed, so I decided to go downstairs for a glass of water. The house was dark as I quietly made my way down the stairs, carefully avoiding the third step that had always creaked. As I got closer to the kitchen, I heard the front door open and close softly, followed by hushed voices. James was back, and it seemed my father had gotten up to speak with him. I froze in the hallway, not wanting to interrupt what sounded like a serious conversation. I was about to turn back when I heard my name mentioned. I heard my father's voice, low but clear in the quiet house, say that I didn't need to know anything and that the conversation would stay between them. I should have just walked away, but a part of me knew that whatever I was about to hear would change everything forever. I remained rooted to the spot, hidden in the shadows of the hallway. My father asked how bad it was. James gave a heavy sigh and said it was about $40,000 now. He admitted that the online poker sites and credit cards had all added up faster than he realized. My breath caught in my throat as I heard the amount of debt he had racked up. I wondered to myself how he had managed to do that while living rent-free with our parents. My father muttered that my mother couldn't know the full amount because she thought it was only half of that. James's voice took on the wheedling tone I remembered from childhood when he wanted to avoid consequences. He admitted that he had messed up and that he had learned his lesson. There was a long pause before my father spoke again, telling him not to worry. He said that they would make me pay for everything. The words hit me like a physical blow. I pressed myself against the wall, hardly daring to breathe. I heard James sound confused but not opposed, asking how. My father continued, saying that I had that fancy job in New York, that condo, and that I had money. He added that I owed the family after everything they had done for me. My mind reeled at the audacity of that last statement. All we have done for you. My father's voice took on a confident tone as he explained their plan. He said they would tell me they wanted to start a family business, something involving property investment or a franchise that sounded legitimate enough that I would want to be a part of it. James sounded skeptical, asking if they really thought I would just give them $40,000. My father corrected him, saying it wouldn't be a gift, but an investment. He told James they would have me take out a loan in my name because my credit score and income would make it easy to qualify. They would promise me returns and a partnership, whatever it took to get me to agree. I felt physically ill. They were planning to defraud me, to saddle me with debt to bail out my brother from his gambling and irresponsible spending. James then wondered what would happen if I asked to see a business plan or wanted to consult my own financial advisor. My father chuckled, saying that my desire for their approval would be their emotional angle. He said they would tell me this was my chance to finally be part of something important with the family and that it would cloud my judgment. Just then, I heard my mother's footsteps on the stairs, and her voice joined their conversation. She sounded like she already knew what they were discussing. My father confirmed they were talking about their plan for me. My mother said that James had told him about the additional credit card, and when my father said yes, and that the total was $40,000, she sighed. She then said that I had an obligation to help my brother because family helps family. She added that I had done well for myself, and it was time for me to contribute back. James quickly agreed, saying that I was always going on about my job and my condo and that I could afford it. My father said I would be there all weekend, and that he would bring up the business idea the next day after dinner to plant the seed. He said they could work on me over the next few months and get me to sign the loan papers by the summer. James added that I always wanted to feel included and that I would probably jump at the chance to finally be part of the family business. His laugh made my skin crawl. I had heard enough. I moved as silently as I could, retreating up the stairs and back to the guest room. I closed the door without a sound and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling as the full impact of what I had just heard washed over me. My family, the people who should have protected me, were instead plotting to use me, to burden me with debt, and to rescue my brother from his self-created financial disaster. They were discussing it so casually, so confidently, as if my exploitation was their right. I thought about all the years I had worked multiple jobs, the nights I had gone to bed hungry to save money, and the countless sacrifices I had made to build financial security for myself. And they planned to take it all away with one manipulative scheme. In that moment, something inside me broke. The last lingering hope that my family might one day see my worth vanished completely. As I sat in the dark room that no longer held any traces of my childhood, I knew with absolute certainty what I needed to do. I didn't sleep that night. How could I, knowing what I now knew? Instead, I sat cross-legged on the bed with my laptop open and methodically worked through what needed to be done. My mind felt strangely calm, operating with a clarity that only comes in moments of crisis. The shock and hurt were there, lurking beneath the surface, but I pushed them aside to focus on protecting myself. First, I reviewed my financial situation. My savings were substantial, but they were spread across multiple accounts. My investments were doing well, but they would incur penalties if I liquidated them early. My condo had built equity, but accessing it would require refinancing. I needed to ensure everything was secure and inaccessible to my family. Next, I considered the personal aspect. The finality of what I was about to do weighed heavily on me. This wouldn't be a temporary distance or a cooling-off period, this would be a fundamental severing of family ties. Was I prepared for that? I thought about my childhood, the constant favoritism, the dismissal of my achievements, and the expectation that I would fend for myself while James received everything. I thought about college, how I had worked myself to exhaustion while my parents funded James's education without question. I thought about all the birthdays and holidays where my gifts were practical afterthoughts while James received exactly what he wanted. And now, the ultimate betrayal, their plan to saddle me with debt to cover his gambling losses and extravagant spending, all while using my desire for family connection against me. Yes, I was prepared to cut ties. I had already been alone in all the ways that mattered for most of my life. I opened my bag and quietly gathered the few belongings I had brought for the weekend. I repacked my toiletries, folded my clothes, and zipped my suitcase without making a sound. I left my mother's birthday gift on the dresser. Despite everything, I wouldn't take back a gift once I'd given it. On a hotel notepad I had brought from my last business trip, I wrote a brief note saying I had an emergency at work and had to return to New York immediately. I wished her a happy birthday. There was no apology and no elaboration. They would assume I had left in the morning, which would give me valuable hours before they realized I was gone. Then I settled in to wait. I needed the house to be deeply asleep before I made my move. At 2:30 a.m., I finally heard James return. His heavy footsteps passed my door, followed by the sound of his bedroom door closing and locking. By 3 a.m., the house was silent except for my father's distant snoring. I picked up my suitcase, slipped my feet into my shoes, and eased the guest room door open. The hallway was dark, but I knew the house well enough to navigate without a light. I crept down the stairs, avoiding the creaky third step, and made my way to the front door. For a moment, I paused in the entryway, looking back at the darkened house that had never truly been a home to me. This would likely be the last time I stood here. The thought brought no sadness, only a sense of long overdue liberation. I slipped out the front door, closing it gently behind me. My rental car was parked in the driveway, and I was grateful for choosing to rent a car rather than letting my parents pick me up from the airport as they had offered. The night was cool and clear as I drove away from my childhood home for the final time. I didn't look back in the rearview mirror. I checked into an airport hotel about 20 minutes away. The night clerk barely looked up from his phone as he processed my information and handed me a key card. By 4 a.m., I was finally in a clean, anonymous hotel room, ready to execute the next phase of my plan. I opened my laptop and logged into my primary bank account. I transferred most of the balance to a secondary account at a different bank, one my parents didn't know existed. I left just enough in the primary account to avoid fees. Next, I called the 24-hour customer service line for my credit cards. I told them I suspected potential fraud attempts might be made in my name and requested additional security measures. For my main card, I requested a complete freeze on new charges until further notice, claiming I had lost my wallet. This would result in a replacement card being sent to my New York address, making my current card unusable. I emailed my financial advisor and requested an urgent video call for the next day to review my entire portfolio and increase security measures on all accounts. I was vague about the reasons but emphasized the urgency. Then, I composed an email to my boss explaining that I needed to take Monday and possibly Tuesday as emergency personal days. I had plenty of vacation time saved, and my team could handle my projects for a few days. Finally, I searched for a New York attorney who specialized in financial security and identity protection. I found a highly rated firm that offered weekend consultations and sent a detailed inquiry through their website. By the time I finished, morning light was filtering through the hotel curtains. I was exhausted but still too wired to sleep. I ordered room service breakfast and sat by the window, watching the sunrise as I contemplated the new reality I had created overnight. My phone began buzzing around 9 o'clock. First a text from my mother asking where I had gone, then another, more concerned, then calls, first from her, then from my father. I silenced the notifications without reading or listening to their messages. At around 11 o'clock, I checked out of the hotel and headed to the airport. I had changed my flight to the earliest available one, paying the change fee without hesitation. As I waited at the gate, I finally allowed myself to process what had happened. The hurt was profound, a physical ache in my chest that made it difficult to breathe. Not because I had lost something I had, but because I had finally accepted I never had it to begin with. My family had never seen me as someone to love and protect, only as a resource to exploit. I boarded my flight to New York with a strange mix of grief and determination. By the time the plane touched down at LaGuardia, I had made peace with my decision. I would protect myself because no one else ever had. As I unlocked the door to my condo that evening, I felt a profound sense of homecoming. This space, purchased with my own hard-earned money, represented everything I had built for myself, despite my family's lack of support. I dropped my suitcase in the entryway and moved through the familiar rooms, touching the furniture and belongings that were truly mine. Then I opened all the windows, letting the cool evening air sweep through the space, symbolically clearing out the last remnants of my family's toxic influence. The next day would bring practical challenges, meetings with my financial advisor and attorney, new security measures to implement, and a new life to build. But that night, in the safety of my own home, I allowed myself to feel the full range of emotions I had been suppressing. I cried for the little girl who had never been enough. I cried for the teenager who had worked herself to exhaustion, trying to earn a love that should have been freely given. I cried for the young woman who had achieved remarkable success, only to have her family view it as an opportunity for exploitation. And then, as the tears subsided, I felt something unexpected: relief. The constant effort of seeking approval from people incapable of giving it had been exhausting. Now that I knew the truth beyond any doubt, I could finally stop trying. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in years. My subconscious had recognized before my waking mind that I had finally freed myself from a lifetime of emotional debt. Sunday morning brought 27 missed calls and 43 text messages from my family. I scrolled through them without reading and then deleted the entire conversation thread. I knew I needed clarity and distance to execute my plan, and their words would only cloud my judgment with emotion. My father had also sent 3 emails with increasingly urgent subject lines: "Where are you?" "Family emergency discussion needed," and finally, "Call home immediately." I deleted those as well. By noon, I had spoken with my financial advisor, who was alarmed by my situation and immediately recommended additional security measures for all my accounts. We set up verbal passwords, removed my parents as emergency contacts, and discussed the possibility of placing a freeze on my credit to prevent unauthorized loans from being taken out in my name. She told me that this kind of family financial exploitation was unfortunately more common than I might think, and that I was right to act quickly. The attorney I had contacted responded to my inquiry and agreed to a video consultation that afternoon. She specialized in cases of family financial abuse and identity theft prevention. For 90 minutes, she outlined a comprehensive strategy to protect my assets and establish legal boundaries with my family. She advised me to document everything, save any communication where they discussed this business opportunity, and even record conversations if it was legal in my state. The more evidence I had of their intentions, she said, the better protected I would be. She also recommended filing reports with financial institutions and credit bureaus, which would create a paper trail and make it difficult for anyone to open accounts or take loans in my name without extensive verification. By Sunday evening, I had implemented most of her recommendations and felt more secure in my financial position, but I knew the emotional confrontation still lay ahead. On Monday morning, I took the personal day I had requested and continued securing my finances. I transferred investment accounts to new institutions, changed all my passwords, and set up 2-factor authentication on everything. I even updated my will, removing my family members as beneficiaries and designating charitable organizations instead. At noon, my brother sent a text asking what was wrong with me because my mom was really upset. I didn't respond. By Monday evening, the calls had escalated to include extended family. My aunt, Linda, my father's sister, left a voicemail expressing concern about my sudden disappearance and asking me to call her back. My cousin, Michael, sent a text asking if I was okay. I responded briefly to him, saying I was fine but was dealing with a personal matter and would explain later. On Tuesday morning, I returned to work, throwing myself into projects that required my full concentration. My colleagues noticed my subdued mood, but I deflected their questions with vague references to family stress. By the end of the day, I felt almost normal, and the familiar routine of work provided a welcome distraction. That evening, I decided it was time to address the situation directly. I couldn't run forever, and I needed closure to fully move forward. I texted my parents that I would call at 8 p.m., and asked them to have James there as well. At 8 o'clock sharp, I started a video call from my home office, a space that made me feel professional and in control. My parents appeared on the screen immediately, their faces tight with anger and confusion. James joined a moment later, looking annoyed at being included. My mother asked what on earth was going on and told me that my leaving on her birthday weekend without saying goodbye had been embarrassing for their guests. I knew her first concern was social embarrassment, not my well-being. I told them evenly that I had an emergency, without elaborating on the lie in my note. My father said I could have called because they had been worried sick. I looked directly into the camera, my voice steady, and told them I had overheard their conversation with James on Friday night. The silence that followed was confirmation enough. My father's face drained of color, and James looked away from the camera. Only my mother seemed confused. She asked what conversation I was talking about. I told her the one about James's $40,000 gambling debt and their plan to trick me into taking out a loan to pay it off. The one where they had talked about manipulating my desire for family connection to get me to sign the papers. My mother's confusion gave way to shock as she turned to look at my father, who then started to talk defensively, saying that nothing had been decided and they were just discussing options. I countered that he had said they would make your sister pay for everything, and that they had talked about me like I was just an ATM, not their daughter. James finally spoke up, saying that I had been eavesdropping on a private conversation and called it real mature. I replied coldly that it was interesting his concern was my eavesdropping rather than the fact that they were planning to defraud me. My father insisted that no one was going to defraud me and that they were going to propose a family business opportunity that would benefit everyone. I told him to stop lying because I had heard everything. I told them I knew about the gambling debts, the credit cards, and the plan to have me take out a loan in my name, and that I knew they intended to manipulate me by using my desire for family approval against me. My mother began to cry, but I couldn't tell if it was from genuine distress or manipulation. Through sobs, she said that families help each other and that James was still my brother, even though he had made some mistakes. I asked her when our family had ever helped me. When I needed help with college, they told me to take out loans and get a job. When I needed emotional support, they were too busy cheering for James. And when I achieved success despite their lack of support, they saw it as an opportunity to exploit me. My father's expression hardened, and he said I had always been selfish, only thinking about myself instead of the family. I laughed without humor and told him that was a rich thing to hear from him. I told him I wanted to make something perfectly clear, would never give James a penny of my money, co-sign a loan, invest in a fake family business, or financially entangle myself with any of them in any way. My father started to call me an ungrateful child, but I cut him off and told him I had secured all my accounts, consulted with attorneys, and documented the conversation. I warned him that if he or anyone in the family tried to access my finances or use my identity, I would press charges without hesitation. James scoffed, saying I was always so dramatic. I told him I wasn't being dramatic, I was protecting myself from the people who should have protected me but instead saw me as a resource to exploit. My mother then asked what people would think when they heard I had abandoned my family, and what they should tell everyone. I replied that they could tell them whatever they wanted, but they should know that if they spread lies about me, I would tell the truth about them, all of it. The lifelong favoritism, the financial neglect, and now this attempt to saddle me with debt to cover James's gambling addiction. My father challenged me, saying I wouldn't dare. I challenged him back to try me, telling him I had nothing to lose because they had made sure of that by never giving me the family support I deserved. The call then descended into chaos, with James cursing, my father making threats, and my mother crying louder. I remained calm, watching their reactions with a detachment that surprised even me. I finally said the conversation was over and told them not to contact me again unless they were ready to apologize and accept that I would never provide financial assistance to any of them. I ended the call before they could respond and sat in silence, processing what had just happened. I had said my piece, established boundaries, and stood up for myself, perhaps for the first time in my life. My phone immediately began buzzing with calls and texts, but I ignored them all. Instead, I opened my laptop and wrote a detailed account of the conversation while it was fresh in my memory, saving it to the folder of documentation my attorney had advised me to maintain. Then, I blocked my family's numbers and email addresses. It was a temporary measure, giving me space to breathe and think without their constant attempts to manipulate me. I could always unblock them later if circumstances changed. That night, I slept fitfully, my dreams filled with arguments and accusations. But when I woke the next morning, I felt stronger, more centered. The confrontation had been necessary, a lance to drain a festering wound that had been poisoning me for years. I was ready to begin healing. Within days of our confrontation, the fallout began. My father's sister, Aunt Linda, called to tell me how disappointed she was in my selfish behavior. My mother's brother wanted to know why I was abandoning the family during a difficult time. Cousins I had barely spoken to in years suddenly had strong opinions about my character and choices. It became clear that my parents had wasted no time spreading their version of events. An ungrateful daughter refuses to help a brother in need, then cuts off all contact with a loving family who had given her everything. At first I attempted to briefly explain my side, but the responses made it clear that minds were already made up. Family loyalty ran deep, and few were interested in considering that the people they had known for decades might be capable of such manipulation. After a week of draining conversations that went nowhere, I decided on a different approach. I drafted a detailed email laying out the facts of my childhood, my self-funded education, and the conversation I had overheard. I did not embellish or exaggerate, the truth was damning enough. I sent this email only to the family members I truly cared about: my grandmother, Rose, who had always shown me kindness; my cousin, Rachel, who had been a friend during childhood summers; and my uncle, David, my mother's younger brother, who had occasionally noticed and commented on the disparity in how my brother and I were treated. "I do not expect you to take sides," I wrote in closing. "I only ask that you consider there might be more to this story than what you have been told. I have removed myself from a harmful situation, and I hope you can respect that decision even if you do not fully understand it." The responses surprised me. My grandmother called the next day, her voice shaking with emotion. "I always saw how they treated you differently," she admitted. "I said something to your mother once years ago, but she dismissed me. I should have been more persistent. I should have done more to protect you." Rachel replied with a simple message: "I believe you." She shared her own observations of family gatherings where James received attention and praise while my achievements were minimized or ignored. Uncle David's response was the most unexpected. He invited me to lunch, and over pasta at a quiet restaurant, he revealed that he had recently cut contact with my mother for similar reasons. "Your mother and father have always had a blind spot when it comes to James," he said. "I am not surprised it escalated to this. You did the right thing protecting yourself." These small validations were healing bright spots in what was otherwise a difficult period of adjustment. While I had been functionally independent from my family for years, the finality of this break brought unexpected waves of grief. Not for what I had lost, but for what I had never had: parents who protected rather than exploited me, who celebrated rather than utilized my success. At work, I threw myself into new projects, volunteering for challenges that required intense focus and long hours. My boss noticed my increased dedication and mistook it for ambition rather than distraction. "Whatever has lit this fire under you, I am all for it," he said during our monthly review. "Your performance has been exceptional." The praise felt good, a reminder that in my professional life, hard work and integrity were recognized and rewarded in ways they never had been in my family. In my personal life, I made a conscious effort to strengthen relationships with friends who had shown themselves to be trustworthy and supportive. I had always kept people at a certain distance, a habit formed from years of emotional self-protection. Now I allowed myself to be more vulnerable, sharing more of my true thoughts and feelings. Lisa, my closest friend since college, had always sensed there was something complicated about my family situation, even though I rarely discussed it. "I always thought it was strange how little you talked about them," she said. When I finally shared the full story over dinner one night, she replied, "Now I understand why." 3 months after the confrontation, I decided I needed a complete change of environment. My company had an opening in their San Francisco office, and I applied for a transfer. The move would mean a lateral shift rather than a promotion, but the opportunity to build a life in a new city, thousands of miles from my past, was too appealing to ignore. When my transfer was approved, I sold my condo for a modest profit and prepared to relocate to the West Coast. The process of sorting through my belongings, deciding what to keep and what to discard, became a metaphor for the emotional work I was doing. Old mementos from my childhood and family went into a box that I stored rather than displayed, not discarded completely, but no longer taking up space in my daily life. San Francisco offered a fresh start. I found a bright apartment with a view of the bay, joined a hiking club to explore my new surroundings, and established a routine that prioritized both professional growth and personal well-being. In my new city, I also found an unexpected resource: a support group for adults from dysfunctional families. The first meeting was uncomfortable, sitting in a circle with strangers and admitting aloud that the people who should have loved me most had instead seen me as a resource to exploit. But as others shared their stories, I recognized patterns and feelings that mirrored my own. The relief of being truly understood was profound. Week after week, I returned, gradually opening up more about my experiences and listening as others did the same. Through the group, I met Aidan, whose parents had remortgaged their house in his name without his knowledge, and Taylor, whose mother had systematically turned family members against her when she refused to continue funding her mother's extravagant lifestyle. Their stories were different from mine in details, but similar in essence: family members who viewed love as transactional and care as conditional. The hardest part, Taylor said during one session, is accepting that they will never be the parents you needed them to be. That no matter what you do, how successful you become, how perfectly you behave, they will never see you clearly or love you properly. Her words resonated deeply. I had spent decades trying to earn the love and approval that should have been freely given, believing that if I just worked harder, achieved more, or proved my worth more convincingly, my parents would finally see me as they saw James. Accepting that this would never happen was both devastating and liberating. Around the 6-month mark of my new life in San Francisco, I received an email from my cousin, Michael. "Thought you should know," he wrote. "James filed for bankruptcy last week. Your parents have been telling everyone they had to cash out their retirement accounts to help him." I felt a complex mix of emotions: vindication that the financial disaster I had narrowly avoided had indeed come to pass, sadness for my parents, who had enabled James to the point of their own financial ruin, and a small, petty satisfaction that justice had been served. But mostly, I felt grateful. Grateful that I had overheard that conversation. Grateful that I had acted quickly to protect myself. Grateful that I had found the courage to break free from the toxic family dynamic that had defined much of my life. 1 year after my move to San Francisco, I was promoted to team leader, managing a small group of financial analysts. My apartment had become a home, filled with plants, art I loved, and furniture chosen for comfort rather than status. I had made real friends, people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. On quiet evenings, I sometimes thought about my family and wondered how they were doing, not with longing or regret, but with the detached curiosity one might feel about distant acquaintances. They had shaped my early life for better and worse, but they no longer determined my happiness or defined my future. I had built something precious, a life entirely my own, free from exploitation and emotional manipulation. It had come at a high cost, but as I watched the sunset over the bay from my window, I knew without a doubt that it had been worth it. 3 years passed with remarkable speed. My life in San Francisco developed its own rhythm and richness. I was promoted again, now managing a larger team and handling significant client relationships. My apartment, once a refuge, had become simply home, filled with memories of dinner parties with friends, quiet mornings with coffee and books, and the comfortable routines of a life well lived. I had dated casually, though I approached relationships with caution. The therapist I had begun seeing shortly after moving helped me recognize how my family experiences had shaped my attachment patterns, my tendency to give too much while expecting too little in return. Slowly, I learned to establish healthier boundaries, to recognize my own worth, and to expect reciprocity in relationships. My volunteer work became an unexpected source of fulfillment. Once a month, I taught financial literacy workshops for young women from disadvantaged backgrounds. Helping them understand money management, credit building, and investing gave me a sense of purpose beyond my career success. "You explain this stuff like someone who had to learn it the hard way," one participant told me after a session on predatory lending. "I did," I replied simply. The contact with my family remained minimal. My grandmother called on my birthday and holidays. Rachel and I exchanged occasional texts and met for coffee when I visited the East Coast for business. Uncle David sent Christmas cards with genuine, thoughtful notes inside. As for my parents and James, I heard news only through these limited family connections. My father had taken a second job after their retirement savings were depleted. My mother had sold most of her jewelry and designer handbags. James had moved to Florida after the bankruptcy, supposedly for a fresh start. I felt no pleasure in their struggles, but no responsibility for them either. The boundaries I had established remained firm, a necessary protection for my hard-won peace. And then on an ordinary Tuesday morning, an email appeared in my personal account that stopped me mid-sip of coffee. From James Wilson at email.com, the subject line read, "Long overdue." The sender was my brother. I had not blocked his new email address when he changed it after moving. For several minutes, I simply stared at the notification, debating whether to delete it unread or satisfy my curiosity. Finally, I clicked. "Samantha," the email began. "I know you probably have no reason or desire to hear from me. I would not blame you for deleting this without reading, but I hope you will give me 5 minutes of your time. I have been in therapy for the past year, dealing with my gambling addiction and the financial disaster I created. Part of my recovery process is making amends to people I have harmed. You are at the top of that list. What I, tried to do to you was inexcusable. There is no justification for attempting to burden you with my debts or for the years of favoritism that preceded that betrayal. I was spoiled, entitled, and completely oblivious to my own privilege within our family dynamic. Since the bankruptcy, I have had to support myself for the first time. I work 2 jobs now, live in a tiny apartment with roommates, and am slowly rebuilding my credit one payment at a time. In other words, I am finally living the reality you dealt with your entire life. I do not expect forgiveness. I do not expect a relationship. I simply wanted you to know that I recognize the harm I participated in, and I am genuinely sorry. James. I read the email 3 times, searching for manipulative undertones or hidden agendas. Finding none, I closed my laptop without responding and went to work, turning the message over in my mind throughout the day. That evening, I called my therapist for an emergency session. "What do you want to do?" she asked after I read her the email. "I don't know," I admitted. Part of me thinks responding in any way reopens a door I closed for good reason. And the other part? I considered the question carefully. The other part wonders if people can truly change. If the brother who was willing to defraud me could become someone capable of genuine remorse. "Those are both valid perspectives," she said. "There is no right answer here, only what feels right to you, and you do not have to decide immediately." I took her advice and gave myself time to process. For 2 weeks, I sat with the email, discussing it in therapy and with close friends whose judgment I trusted. In the end, I composed a brief reply. "James, thank you for your email. I appreciate the apology and am glad to hear you are working on yourself. I need time to consider what, if any, relationship I might want to have with you in the future. Please respect that boundary. Samantha." His response came within hours. "I completely understand. Take all the time you need. I am grateful you responded at all." 3 months later, after further consideration and therapy sessions, I agreed to a video call. The conversation was awkward but surprisingly civil. James looked different. The designer clothes and confident smirk were replaced by a simple t-shirt and a more thoughtful expression. He told me about his recovery program, his modest job at a local tech company, and his struggle to establish financial independence. I shared limited information about my life in San Francisco, my career, and my volunteer work. We did not discuss our parents much, though he mentioned they were still struggling financially and emotionally with the consequences of their choices. "They still don't fully understand what they did wrong," he admitted. "They see themselves as victims of circumstance rather than creators of their own problems." I nodded, unsurprised. Some people never develop that self-awareness. At the end of the call, we agreed to proceed cautiously. Monthly emails, perhaps another call in a few months. No promises, no expectations, just a tentative opening to see if something healthier might be possible between us as adults. I did not know if this cautious reconnection would lead anywhere meaningful, or if James's change was temporary or permanent, but I had learned enough about myself to know that I could establish boundaries and walk away again if necessary. The greatest lesson from this 3-year journey was not about family betrayal or financial self-protection, though those were important. It was about the power of creating my own definition of family, of surrounding myself with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. I had learned that sometimes walking away from toxic relationships, even blood relationships, is the only path to peace. That forgiveness, when it comes, is for your own healing rather than the other person's absolution. That establishing firm boundaries is not selfish but necessary for well-being. Most importantly, I had learned that my worth was never dependent on my family's recognition of it. That the financial security I had built, the career I had established, the home I had created, and the relationships I had formed were all a testament to my own strength and resilience. Sometimes losing a family that was never truly yours is the only way to find the peace you deserve. And sometimes protecting yourself financially is the first step toward protecting yourself emotionally. As I finished the video call with James and closed my laptop, I felt neither elation nor dread, just a quiet certainty that whatever happened next, I would be okay. I had protected myself when no one else would. I had built a life worth living on my own terms, and that in the end was the greatest victory of all. Have you ever had to protect yourself from people who should have been protecting you? How did you find the strength to establish boundaries and move forward? Share your experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who might need to hear that it is okay to protect yourself, even from family. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember that sometimes the family we choose is more valuable than the family we are born into.